Douglass was first one way, and then he was a completely different way. That means that when he was a Garrisonian, he thought that, this is again through the 1840s, he thought the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. But then he tells you in his autobiography, I became an editor and I started reading more widely. And I came to understand the different kinds of abolitionism. And there is this school of abolitionists who believe the Constitution is actually anti-slavery and it can be an instrument for us to achieve our objective. And he came to think that was persuasive. And so from 1851 onward, Douglass is defending the proposition that the Constitution actually is, and properly read, it is an anti-slavery document.
Hi everyone, this is Tony Williams, a senior fellow at BRI, and we are pleased to bring you the first episode of an exciting new series of scholar talks on Black intellectuals and the African American experience. We're really honored to have scholar Peter Myers, who is going to discuss his thoughts on Frederick Douglass. And the guiding question for all of these videos in the series will be, what contribution did this person make to understanding the Black experience in America? Peter Myers is a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire and an honored visiting graduate faculty at Ashland University, where he has recently edited a civil rights core documents volume. He is also the author of Frederick Douglass, Race and Rebirth of American Liberalism, and he's worked on race in America for several BRI curricula and appeared on a previous scholar talk, which you should check out, on Martin Luther King. Pete, I want to thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Great. Well, I've told you personally many times, I love this book. I think it's really a remarkable book on Frederick Douglass, but really understanding the broader issues of the American founding and race in America and Douglass himself. Really, I'm going to embarrass you a little bit. One of the most important books I've read in the last few years. And so we're really, really honored and glad you could join us. So the first question I have relates to a quote from the introduction to your book, which I think really dials in deep very well on really just understanding Douglass broadly. You write that Frederick Douglass made it his great life's work to instruct his fellow Americans on the first principles of government, to bring the nation into consistency with itself, and so to conceive a nobler liberalism than America had yet known. So my question is, what were those principles, and how does Douglass push America for a greater consistency in achieving its founding ideals and really realizing its aspirations?
What were the principles can be answered in a pretty simple way to start with. The principles are the principles that are summarized in the Declaration of Independence, that all human beings are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. People are equal in rights and have, and these are natural, unalienable rights. Okay, so those are the principles the country is dedicated to. Douglass called them saving principles, and not perfectly realized in his day, of course. And that's what he was trying to call his fellow citizens to achieve. One quick thing about that, Douglass's most famous speech that we might direct our audience to if they're not already familiar with it, is called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," that he delivered actually on July the 5th, 1852. And every 4th of July for us, you're going to find some commentary, and the commentary is going to be some mixed, sort of mixed, taking different opinions about that speech. Douglass's attitude toward July the 4th was maybe complicated, but toward the Declaration itself, his attitude was not at all complicated. As I said, these are saving principles. Really quickly, you asked another question: how did he go about pushing America toward that? And the answer is free speech. One of the things I like to quote later in the book: "Great is the power of human speech," says Douglass. He made his career after he escaped slavery, essentially being an abolitionist and then a civil rights lecturer. And he made his case one final point, not just by arguments, not just by explaining to people in some kind of dry philosophic way why slavery is wrong and freedom is right, but by telling stories, by making his life into this great inspiring story in his autobiographies, which people also ought to read. So that's for starters.
Great. Well, dialing a little bit more on the next question, why did Douglass believe that slavery was fundamentally at odds with this moral order and the American founding principles, as you mentioned, in the Declaration of Independence? Or really my question is, why did he believe slavery was wrong?
Yeah, that too can be a really long answer or a really short answer. And Douglass gave a series of lectures around 1850 on slavery, and he took up that exact question: why is slavery wrong? And he said, my answer is simple. Maybe I should be forgiven, or he, for his what we would now say gendered language, but he said the answer is because a man is himself. Meaning a human being, a person, is self-owning, his own self. And how you get to that conclusion, there's an argument in political philosophy that we can summarize really quickly. And I think also in Douglass's rhetoric and in his real thinking, there's an argument from biblical faith. And so the political philosophy argument boiled down to its essentials is really this: there's a natural ordering of things, and the world of nature is articulated into kinds of things, species of things. It's almost an Aristotelian argument. And so there's such a thing as a human nature. A human being is a kind of a thing, and a human being is distinguished from other parts of the animal creation by essentially two things: by a rational capability for freedom and a moral desire for freedom. And those two things added together get you to the conclusion that people have a right to liberty, that people are in that sense self-owning. The biblical argument is that slavery is against God's law. And that carries an interesting implication, which he draws out. That means that the essence of slavery really is a rebellion against God's order. Because God established, this natural articulation of beings, and so you're treat a human being as though a human being were livestock, a part of the lower animal creation, is a violation of the divine ordering. So long before the Civil War, Douglass is saying that the slaveholders are rebels. Of the essence of slavery is moral rebellion.
Right. And speaking of rebellion, how does Douglass justify resistance to the tyranny, to the injustices of slavery that you just mentioned? All
right. Resistance is a significant word. So let's say, it's significant in his day as well as ours. Let's say two kinds of resistance. Resistance by force of law, resistance by force of arms. He first has to overcome the influence of the man, the abolitionist who was his mentor, William Lloyd Garrison, who was, in the language of the day, part of a body of thought called non-resistance, which was derived from a couple of biblical texts: turn the other cheek and resist not evil, and so forth. Don't return evil for evil. So the Garrisonians think we have to undo slavery by speech, by moral suasion, as it was called. And Douglass, I think, never completely bought into that, but bought some of it when he was with the Garrisonians through the 1840s. He meets John Brown in 1847, and John Brown is trying to convince him that the slaveholders are not going to give up slavery either voluntarily or peacefully. So it's going to have to be by one or another kind of force. we'll get to this, I know. Douglass changed his mind about the Constitution, and he came to think that the federal government actually does have legal power, legal authority to undo slavery. But if you couldn't get the federal government to do that, then other alternatives are morally open, where the law fails, where politics fails. The violation of natural rights justifies forceful resistance. And so Douglass did come to support that pretty loudly and openly in the 1850s.
And so you mentioned Douglass's views on the Constitution. So what were these complex views on whether the Constitution is pro-slavery or anti-slavery, and maybe how do they change over time?
Yeah, that's also, a really big and important subject. I'm tempted. This is going to be off-putting to some listeners and maybe gratifying to others. Speaking the language of The Chosen, if you've been watching that series, Douglass was first one way, and then he was a completely different way. That means that when he was a Garrisonian, he thought that, this is again through the 1840s, he thought the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. But then he tells you in his autobiography, I became an editor, and I started reading more widely, and I came to understand the different kinds of abolitionism, and there is this school of abolitionists who believe the Constitution is actually anti-slavery, and it can be an instrument for us to achieve our objective. And he came to think that was persuasive. And so from 1851 onward, Douglass is defending the proposition the Constitution actually is, and properly read, it is an anti-slavery document. How he came to that conclusion, he was influenced by certain writers, foremost among whom is Lysander Spooner, but his reading of the Constitution is interesting. And law professors, at least a certain slice of them, still find it, his and Spooner's arguments, persuasive. Some do anyway. It's partly based on a strict textualism, meaning that the word slave or slavery never appears in the original, the Founders' Constitution. And it's also informed by a principle that where there is ambiguity in the US Constitution, and you need to interpret it, you resolve the ambiguities by reference to the overall goals, the objects of the Constitution, as they said. And that means you have to resolve the ambiguities in favor of liberty, in favor of the natural rights idea. One last point about Douglass and the Constitution. There are different ways. I mean, once you get to the conclusion the Constitution's anti-slavery, that tells you something important, but not everything, because there are lots of different ways of judging the Constitution anti-slavery and different degrees of it. The short way to put it is that for Douglass took the most radically anti-slavery reading possible of the Constitution. That the Constitution is not just anti-slavery in the sense that it's looking down the road to emancipation. The Constitution is actually abolitionist, meaning that it not only provides the federal government the power to abolish slavery instantly and everywhere, but it provides the duty to do so. Slavery was unconstitutional. We could talk about, the passages in the Constitution why he says that, but I'll let you follow up if you want to talk more about that.
Right. Well, and a very different view from Lincoln, right? Who believed in the anti-slavery Constitution, but took a different reading of the powers of the government to immediately abolish it. Right?
That's very interesting. Yes, that was Lincoln's view. You might say all the way up until it wasn't. I mean, Lincoln was a gradualist, and Douglass was a proponent of immediate abolition. But once the war broke out, Lincoln effected immediate abolition. And so Lincoln became a hero to Frederick Douglass, which is not what he was to Douglass in the earlier parts of his presidency.
Right. My last question is a big one, and really at the heart of this series. Douglass really profoundly and deeply reflected on the Black experience in America, and really came up with complex answers. And we may not be able to dig around in all of that complexity just in the time we have remaining. But what were some of the most important challenges and impediments for African Americans in the American regime and American society? And what paths does Douglass envision as the best paths forward for achieving those ideals of liberty and justice and equality?
Okay, about the challenge first. I think, again, a good way to address that in summary is to say, Douglass says something really interesting in 1862, says it a couple of times, also again, 1863. He's anticipating the end of the Civil War, and he's anticipating victory. And he says, the day that we win, the day the Union forces prevail, the slaveholders surrender, is going to be the most trying day for American virtue in the nation's history. And what he meant by that is that the problem of abolishing slavery, which was hugely difficult, in the first decades of the Republic, is not the biggest problem. The bigger problem beyond that will be the problem of integrating the class of people formerly enslaved with the rest of the country. That is, securing full, equal citizenship, civil rights for everybody. That's going to be a harder problem because slavery by that time was concentrated in a region, and hostility to slavery was prevalent in the northern states. But there was considerable anti-Black sentiment in the northern states as well as the South. So race prejudice was pretty much universal and deeper than the support for slavery. And so that's what he meant in saying that the problem is going to be harder, even the remaining work after the Civil War. So about the paths he envisioned, let me say a general thing and then a couple of particular things, and that'll have to do. The general thing is this. I think Douglass thought it's a basic principle of political philosophy, really, that if you boil down the problems of political life, of all political life everywhere, they are essentially two problems. I mean, one is to secure justice against the natural human propensity to do injustice to each other. So liberation, if we want to put it that way. And the second part of the problem is elevation, meaning the cultivation of human excellence, of virtue. So securing rights, cultivating virtue. Those are the problems. And in a way, those are Douglass's foremost concerns throughout his whole life. And so there are two tracks that Black Americans are going to have to travel along at once. And one of them is, this is one of his words again, agitation for rights. And so in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, that means especially voting rights and property rights and educational opportunities, let's say, and just the guarantee of the full range of civil rights, access, fair treatment in the criminal justice system. But beyond that, beyond the agitation for the equal civil rights, Douglass, speaking to Black Americans, was essentially saying it's on us. The elevation part, the self-improvement part, the preparation to exercise the rights fruitfully that we're trying to win, the cultivation of the full range of human virtues, that's not something anybody else can do for us. We've got to do that for ourselves. So let me put a couple of plugs in that one of them is following up on something you and I were talking about before the broadcast. It's often thought that Douglass's heirs in American political thought are W.B. Du Bois and Martin Luther King Jr. And that's not wrong. They are. But I really would stress adding Booker T. Washington to that. I mean, when Washington says, in his most famous speech, it is important and right that we get all of the rights that are proper to American citizenship and to human beings. But it's no less important that we be prepared to exercise those rights. And that we have to do for ourselves. It's Martin Luther King called it a two-front war. And that was exactly Douglass's position also. So the other plug is this argument for racial development is, as it's now called, is an argument made by Shelby Steele and lately by Robert Woodson in the 1776 Project. I think that's entirely in the spirit of Frederick Douglass too.
Excellent. Pete Myers, thank you for joining us. The book is Frederick Douglass, Race and the Rebirth of American Liberalism, a really important book everyone should go out and read. And I want to thank all of you for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. And please check out our next installments in the series Black Intellectuals and the African American Experience. And also check out our previous series on the Cold War and the presidency, and our upcoming series on pivotal battles in American history. Thank you very much.